Hello and welcome back to the Welsh Lady ASMR. Today we are going to be looking at another few years from my Reader's Digest book, Yesterday's Britain. I hope you are enjoying watching these videos as much as I am enjoying making them. I love looking through the pages of this book. I'm finding it educational and nostalgic in equal measure. If you haven't seen the other videos in this series, I will put a link for the playlist up here and down in the description below. Also, please do remember to subscribe. In today's video, we are looking at the years from 1945 to 1949. So called the austerity years. So let's get straight in and look at post-war Britain. (1945 to 49), the austerity years. This group of lovely ladies, smiling despite it all. They are in freezing cold conditions, it's snowing, and rationing clearly still in place. These ladies are queuing in the freezing cold weather and yet still managing to look cheerful. The introduction page here says, once the euphoria of victory faded away, it became clear how much the war had cost. Britain was utterly exhausted, but the people struggled on. The country needed to be rebuilt for the peace. But for many years the regime of rationing was even tighter than it had been in the war. And this is the celebrations that were held when soldiers came back from the war, and everyone looking quite jubilant in this photograph. Returning soldiers were greeted like heroes by their neighbours. But the boys who went away were not the boys that came back. They were men. Yeah, sure they must have had some pretty awful experiences. And not only the men had changed, but according to this article, the women had changed too. Some of them hadn't seen husbands for years. Fathers came back and hadn't ever met their children. Imagine how disturbing that must have been. This photograph is men coming back from war and being given what they were called demob suits. Army life, it says here, ended as it began with a brief trip to the quartermaster's stores. On their release from the forces, soldiers were given a civilian suit, a hat, a shirt, 2 pairs of underpants, 2 collars, a tie, a pair of shoes, 2 pairs of socks, a Macintosh, 2 studs, and a pair of cufflinks, all packed in a flat cardboard box. Women, if they had been in the services, were also offered a demob suit, but unlike the men, they had the option of taking money and clothing coupons instead. And they've got these GI brides here. When the American forces came to the UK, a lot of the GI soldiers, well, I say a lot, yeah, many thousands, married British brides. And at the end of the war, these brides were waiting patiently to go to America to join their husbands. They were called GI brides. They were marshalled like raw recruits on their way to Southampton and then on to the USA. On a positive note, there was plenty of work, but there was an expectation that women who had been doing men's work during the war, of course, were expected to give up their jobs for the returning men. And frankly, even if they wanted to stay on in work, there was nothing they could do about it. But one thing was certain: never again would women be forced into the drudgery of domestic service. They had tasted the independence and the better pay of factory or office work, and there would be no going back. Still no equal pay, of course. It also meant all of this work that people had money in their pockets. And after the drudgery and hardships of the war, a lot of people flocked to resorts in Britain to spend some of their cash. The war came to an end just as the summer holiday season was beginning. Now that fun was no longer rationed, Britons put all their ingenuity into blowing some cash. And we've got the classic British couple at a seaside resort here, in their deck chairs on the beach. Suits and knotted handkerchiefs for the gents. Ladies wearing stockings, shoes and dresses. I'm sure it was rather wonderful to spend time with families and have some fun at the lovely seaside resorts. During the war, of course, all of the coastline of England had been shut, and tangles of barbed wire and keep out signs. But the beaches after the war were given back to the people. The people that first summer swarmed onto the coast like an invading army. They moved from inland cities to the resort towns of Brighton, Folkestone, Great Yarmouth, Skegness and Blackpool. And they brought with them all the old holiday tackle, buckets and spades, knotted handkerchiefs, blankets, thermos flasks and plastic mugs. Also, there'd been some improvements in conditions at work. Labour's government social and economic policies meant more workers were feeling the benefits of paid holidays. And actually, there wasn't much to spend cash on. Of course, clothes were still rationed, but a trip to the coast was one good way of using up some money. Holidays abroad were, of course, out of the question, and really, Europe, of course, had been ravaged by war. And this is one holiday weekend, the queues and queues of people trying to board trains to start their holidays. And here we've got the lack of toys for children. Of course, austerity during the war had meant that there was no raw materials to make toys, teddies, etc. And even after the war, that situation didn't improve much. It says here that for the war effort, many treasure train sets were sacrificed for Spitfire scrap metal. I've heard my family members saying that metal railings outside houses during the war were given up for the war effort to be melted down and turned into, well, planes, ammunition, etc. So toys were a commodity that were very much recycled amongst families and friends or made out of old clothes. But children found amusements in other ways. Quote here, "We all used to make carts from sets of old pram wheels. We sawed up old planks and nailed them across and raced them down the streets. Everyone did it." I remember that. They were called caddies. Even boys, more boys than girls anyway, used to make these little carts out of pram wheels when I was a child. So the first toys to be produced after the war were printed games such as Ludo or Snakes and Ladders. Jigsaw puzzles made a comeback, but were now mounted on card rather than more expensive plywood. Once the government lifted restrictions on raw materials, factories started to make other toys. Dolls were made from hard plastics. Boys longed for Meccano. Very much a classic toy when I was a child as well. But Britain needed cash, and most new toys were destined for export. So many parents became amateur toy makers. Fathers whittled scraps of wood into aeroplanes or cars. Mothers fashioned remnants and rags into dolls. Sport making a big comeback. I think there was huge support for the football games. I think people just enjoyed having fun, going out and enjoying themselves. Modern music, these little record players, and the music imports from America, jazz and swing. Nights out. And of course the theatre. American shows were immense hits, but some girls preferred to dance into the small hours, even if it meant waiting for a night bus home. Cinemas, of course, had a heyday post-war, and most people went out a few nights a week to the pictures. The cinema newsreel was also the only way to see moving pictures of current news stories. Otherwise, it was on radio sets at home. Television had as yet to make inroads. Rationing goes on and on. And there was a horrendous winter straight after the war. I think it snowed from February to the end of March. Imagine that, after the hardship of war. A very hard winter to follow. This sign says horse flesh, no coupons required. Most people would have drawn the line at eating horse meat, but then they were not always told. I think it mentions here then about whale meat as well, which was not popular. Yeah, this page is about that winter, 1947, so yeah, 2 years after the end of the war. The snow started in January and it didn't melt until March the 16th. And then, with all of that snow, cold conditions, then with all the thaw came floods. I mean, it must have been like an apocalypse. Yeah, sparse kitchen cupboards. Very few ingredients to make nice meals. Dried eggs. I'd never heard of this. Snook. Supplies of food were so short that even powdered egg, much sniffed at during the war, was a prize to be hoarded. One post-war novelty was snook, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, a kind of mackerel imported from South Africa. It's an appetizing name, and the unappealing picture on the tin put people off, but in fact didn't taste bad. These restaurants, bread, which had been freely available during the war, the government started rationing bread. Yeah, it must have just gone from bad to worse. And then labour in the home wasn't a picnic either. This is a mangle used to wring clothes out because they were washed in these tubs with a little agitator on a wooden handle. And washing was of course done outside, and winter or summer. Yeah, hard life. Rationing, of course, meant shortages of fuel as well. So, private car owner, not that there were many in working class areas, but fuel was reserved for commercial vehicles and tractors. There was a general election in 1945, and the result was a bit of a shock. Winston Churchill was out, and Clement Attlee's Labour Party was in by a landslide. I think people felt Churchill was a very good leader during the war, but they felt post-war it was time for a change. Voters' priorities were now housing, employment, and the promise of social security, as outlined in the Beveridge Report of 1942. The economist Sir William Beveridge, he had a blueprint, and it was quite simple: abolish poverty through social insurance. And at the same time, the Labour government launched a huge programme of reform. The Bank of England was nationalised, as were gas and electricity industries, the coal mines, and the railway network. And there was an ambitious council house building programme. And this picture here is treatment for vitamin D deficiency, which caused rickets. And artificial sunshine was the cure in the form of an ultraviolet lamp. Oh, these poor children, their little goggles on. Of all Labour's reforms, the most radical was our beloved National Health Service. It's hard to believe that it's really that recent that it's been introduced. Free healthcare for all at the point of delivery. At the end of the Second World War, Britons were much healthier than they had been at the start of the century. Their life expectancy had increased, and diphtheria, whooping cough, tuberculosis and scarlet fever were all in sharp decline, and typhoid had been almost eliminated. Mobile dental surgeries were introduced for rural areas. Glasses were free. There was some opposition initially to the National Health Service, but it went through anyway. So, July the 5th, 1948, the National Health Service began. And aren't we proud of that? For the first time ever, a comprehensive range of medical services, including prescriptions, was available completely free of charge. And the wonder drug. Again, hard to believe it was this recent, but penicillin became available. How many hundreds of thousands of lives has that simple medicine that we take for granted now? How many lives has that saved? The days of a completely free NHS were numbered almost from the start. The cost was much higher than originally anticipated. So they were forced to introduce charges for false teeth and spectacles in 1951. But people on low incomes were exempt from all charges. And we're still really fighting the same battles even now, aren't we, with the NHS and what is free and what you pay for. People's expectations, of course, very, very difficult to manage on the budget of the NHS. Another problem was housing, a housing shortage. So many homes had been destroyed during the bombing campaigns, and women had often gone to live with families while their husbands were away in the war. But when they came back, clearly the families wanted some privacy, and there was a huge shortage of homes. So a lot of army camps were taken over by families who just moved in. They must have been very, very basic, but I guess it was better than some of the slums and really, really bad housing, overcrowding that people were experiencing elsewhere. The answer, in part anyway, were these little prefabricated buildings. Prefabs consisted of an aluminium frame, asbestos sheets, and about 2,000 components. They could be assembled in 4 hours and were expected to last 10 years, but many were still being lived in the 60s. Each plot has its own little garden, and I think people who moved in these loved them. The space, indoor bathrooms, a garden, must have been wonderful. So let's have a little look at the timeline. 1945 to 1949. July 1945, the Labour Party under Clement Attlee wins the general election by a landslide. October, the United Nations come into existence when 29 nations ratify its charter. Books that came out: Animal Farm by George Orwell, Brideshead Revisited by Evelyn Waugh. What else? Films: I Know Where I'm Going, The Lost Weekend, Brief Encounter. I love that film. Absolutely love it. 1946, April, with Stalin's backing, the Communist Party is relaunched in the eastern sector of Germany as the Socialist Unity Party. In November 1946, IBM introduces the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer, ENAC. It is later recognized as the first digital computer. books that came out. The Common Sense Book of Baby and Childcare by Benjamin Spock. I know my mother relied heavily on the advice of Dr. Spock. Films, The Best Years of Our Lives, The Big Sleep, It's a Wonderful Life, another film I absolutely love. 1947, January, Britain's coal industry is nationalised. In the February, French fashion designer Christian Dior introduces the new look. In June, the Marshall Plan is unveiled, whereby the USA pledges to help pay for the reconstruction of Europe and of the defeated nations in particular. In August, British rule in the Indian subcontinent ceases. 2 new states, India and Pakistan, are born of partition. 1948. Britain, France and Benelux sign the Brussels Treaty of Military and Economic Cooperation. In July, the National Health Service comes into operation. Britain sends forces to Malaya to defend rubber planters. All Commonwealth citizens are granted the status of British subjects. The Morris Minor is launched. Oh, that was a gorgeous car. Beautiful, and you still see them around now. 1949, January, murderess Ruth Allen is the first woman to be hanged for 12 years. In February, clothes rationing is lifted. That must have been a fantastic feeling. 1948, Princess Elizabeth gives birth to her son Charles, who is now, of course, King Charles III. In the May, the Soviet blockade of Berlin comes to an end after 11 months. The French, British and American zones of occupation are reconstituted as the Federal Republic of Germany. This is a funny one. In August, starlings perching on the minute hand of Big Ben slow the clock by 4.5 minutes. Ah, dear. Well, next time we come together for a video from this book, I think we're on to happier times. 1950 to 59. Apparently, we'd never had it so good. So I think this will be a little bit more of a cheerful video, and I do hope you can join me. Until then,